Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. Guys, I'm so excited to have you guys back with me in season 3, and I would love if you would leave a review so other innovators like you can find us. Guess what else is going on, y'all? We have Estonia joining us as one of the 47 countries that are now listening to the podcast. Lastly, go over to YouTube. This is now a video podcast, so go subscribe to our channel and check us out there as well. Well, I'm super excited, guys, for the conversation we're going to have today with my guest, Michael F. Schein. So excited to talk about his new book, which I'll tell you about in just a second. But he is the founder and president of Microfame Media, and it's a company that specializes in making coaches and consultants famous in their fields. So some of you are going to be really excited for this conversation today. Some of his clients have included eBay, LinkedIn, Citrix, and he's also a writer for Forbes, Psychology Today, you name it, right? Huffington Post, he's written there. So excited to have this conversation. He has a book out right now called The Hype Handbook. So it's 12 indispensable success secrets from the world's greatest propagandists, self-promoters, cult leaders, mischief makers, and boundary breakers. Tell me you're not excited to have this conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Hey, Natalie, I am very excited to be here.
I am excited to have you. So I gotta hear a backstory here. You wrote this book. Wow, the title alone is just very intriguing. I'm sure that our listeners are going to want to go get it. But talk to me about like what inspired this title. What was the research behind it?
Yeah, it's a long story, and part of it just comes down to the fact that I wanted to write a really great book. Even though I own a business, I didn't want to own a business when I was young for the longest time. I didn't even want to be in business. I wanted to do something artistic. You know, before the when we were just chatting before the show, you were talking about, you know, you were really interested in the arts when you were a kid.
Yeah, that's right.
And yeah, so was I. I was really interested in writing fiction. I was really interested in, you know, music.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I always wanted to write books. I thought they would be novels like, you know, Roald Dahl and C.S. Lewis and Stephen King. But one thing
Yeah.
led to another. I got really interested in music. I played in bands, and I was always interested in the kind of musicians, like punk rock musicians and David Bowie, who were as much about the hype, and hip hop too, who were as much
Yeah.
about the hype as they were about the music. So it wasn't just about getting up there and singing or strumming a guitar. It was about the stage show and the mystique and doing crazy things to fill up the room. So as time went on, I got into the corporate world to make a living. I got tired
Yeah.
of that. I ended up becoming a corporate, or I shouldn't say corporate, but a freelance business copywriter and writer. And I had a really hard time driving attention to my work.
Mm-hmm.
I had become kind of corporatized. So instead of that kind of benevolently mischievous approach I used to have when I was promoting my band's shows and filling up clubs, I was trying to do A/B testing and search engine optimization
Yeah.
and whatever, and that gave me no advantage. That was what everyone was doing. So at a certain point, out of desperation, I started to say, you know, I don't think marketing is so useful. Marketing is just doing what everyone's doing. That's about using technology. What I'm into is hype. All those people who didn't really think of themselves as marketers, who were better than anybody at driving a whole lot of attention and getting a result. I mean, and some of those were those band managers, but some of them were some nasty people like cult leaders, some really influential people like civil rights leaders. And
Mm-hmm.
I tried to figure out, what do they have in common? Are there any underlying principles? So that really transformed my business and my life. I started a company around it. At first, it was an agency. It turned into a slightly different kind of company, which we can talk about. And I don't know. This was, I just thought the world needed this book because there are so many misconceptions out there about all of this stuff.
Yeah, I'm just, as you talk about what you learned from some of those cult leaders, I would love to lean into that a little bit because I think everyone's interest is now peaked. And obviously, you have to go get the book to really know the whole thing. But I would love to take just like a section. I mean, for example, cult leaders. I would think most of us feel like we couldn't learn anything from a cult leader. But talk to us. I mean, what were some of the things that you found?
So I remember when I was a teenager, I was watching TV, just flipping around back when you flipped around and you couldn't choose what you wanted to see. Excuse me. And
Remember
I
those days?
remember that. Yeah. So I remember on one channel, there was a documentary about the Grateful Dead. And on the other channel was like some televangelist. And I was flipping back and forth, and in the audience of the Grateful Dead, there were all these hippies who were swaying and flopping around and, falling on the ground. And then I went over to the televangelist, and all these people with much shorter hair were swaying and flopping around and going. And I said, wow, these are about as different messages and communities and content as you could get. But the effect on these people are exactly the same. What's that about? And it turns out there's this sense of tribalism. There's the use of sound and music, and sensory cues. There's repetition. So what I became very interested in is, there's this concept that the content of what someone is quote unquote selling determines whether it's ethical, useful, or moral. So if someone has a death cult that gets a lot of people excited and does horror and they do horrible things, that means that nothing that they did was effective. But obviously it was effective. They got people to do things that they would never do. So was it the message that was effective, or was it something they understood about mass psychology, right? And that's fascinating to me. I mean, if you look at Tony Robbins, if you look at an Amway rally, if you look at a Barack Obama, thing. A lot of the strategies are very similar. Barack Obama was big on staging. He had giant pillars behind him. He was big on symbolism. So to me, the concept is a lot of bad people, like cult leaders and things, they get this stuff naturally. They see the world as it really is. They understand it intuitively. They don't need a teacher. But the rest of us, we let our emotions get in the way. And that's a good thing. We don't want to go around doing some of these things. The problem with that is some of the best people with the best ideas, they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They don't understand. They willfully reject driving attention and emotion around what they're selling, what their messages are. And as a result, all the nastiest people are hyping things up, and such a small sliver of the great stuff is getting an audience. And it became very important to me, especially with what I'm seeing going on right now, to sort of correct that balance.
Wow. So it's this idea that I think that you can take the psychology of something that's maybe been used for ill and figure out if you can kind of almost reverse engineer that psychology. Then
Right.
how could you actually take something used for ill, use it for good, use it for positive, so to speak, understanding the psychology behind it? Am I summarizing that in any way accurately?
That's 100% exactly right. And there's one thing I would add to that. I would say that on balance, the people who use it for ill, there are more of them. And it's not that the strategies are inherently evil, it's that a lot of these people are what clinical psychologists call they call the disorder, it's a bucket of disorders called antisocial personality disorder. So narcissism, psychopathy, sociopathy, things like that. And when they do lab experiments with these kind of people, especially sociopaths, they'll put them in interpersonal situations that most people would consider stressful, and they measure their pulse, and their pulse doesn't go up.
Wow.
So the thing about people who are sociopaths and things like that, which a lot of cult leaders and people are, is that they don't let emotion get in the way of their interpersonal dynamics. So they can look at people as chess pieces, right? So as a result, as a result, they can do this stuff really well. Whereas the rest of us are kind of like, I don't know, it doesn't feel right. I'm not so sure. My work should speak for itself, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with that is that we confuse cause and effect, right? We say, hey, nasty people, sociopaths are doing this stuff. So this stuff can't be accurate because I don't want to believe the world works that way. But the reality is, human beings are designed not to see the world accurately. They're
Mm.
designed to see the world in a way that lets us survive and lets us reproduce, right? So we're not very rational. So the light in the darkness is that there's a small sliver of people who use the exact same strategies very positively. And usually they're people who care so much about their cause that they're willing to learn these things, and they have a moral code that lets them sort of stay on center. And they also know how to emotionally regulate. They work on emotional
Mhm.
regulation. So Martin Luther King is a great example. He was an excellent master of a lot of some of these principles, which he used in the media. Warren Buffett, however you feel about him, he used many of the same strategies I talk about in the book that Charles Manson used, one of the worst people in civilization's history, right? But we can talk about that. So I think part of it is giving people the good people a handbook to do this stuff ethically, but part of it is just making the case that to make the world a better place, the better people need to learn how to hype themselves up.
Okay, so like in my mind, I want to ask you like three more questions, but then part of me wants to stay on this linear comparison between Charles Manson and Warren Buffett. Like, let's spend a
Yeah.
moment on that.
It's an interesting story. I mean, I was really surprised by this story when I learned it in my research, and I had to include it in the book. So, it's a pretty famous thing among fans of Warren Buffett and finance that he's very proud of his Dale Carnegie Institute diploma. So he took the Dale
Yeah,
Carnegie um, course, and he went to I don't he went to I think Columbia, and he doesn't have that diploma on his wall, but he has the Dale Carnegie diploma. And Dale Carnegie was the guy who wrote the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. And one of
yeah,
the there was a lot that Warren Buffett got out of that, but one of the main tenets of that philosophy is what they call make the other fellow think the idea is his. So what that means is that
yeah.
if you want to persuade people of things, instead of saying this is what I want to do, you ask them a series of questions and massage the situation so that it feels very collaborative, right?
Yep.
And the subsequent research has been done since the 30s when that book came out, and there's a very real psychological phenomenon called psychological reactance. And some people have a higher threshold for it and some people have a lower threshold, but what it means is that people when you try to tell someone to do something, even if it's not good, even if it's good for them, they will push back against it because
Mhm.
autonomy is something that human beings really crave.
Yeah,
So the Charles Manson thing is much less known. I mean, what's known about him is that he started this murderous cult who went in and killed all these people. But
yeah,
so Charles Manson, before he went to prison the first time in the 50s, he was a criminal. He was abused as a child. I mean, but he was a pimp and he was a car thief. He was a
yeah.
low level petty criminal, very damaged guy. But when he was in prison, they were offering courses on the Dale Carnegie Institute, which they no longer offer because of this. So
No.
he took the class and became their star student. And this was a guy who was like barely literate when he went to prison. He dropped out of high school very early. And he became this like star student of the program. And the piece that he took out of it the most that he was really obsessed with was make the other fellow feel like the idea is his. So when he came out of this program and came out of prison, the hippie thing was going on, and he was older than the hippies. And so another principle is packaging, which we can talk about. But he repackaged himself as this like counterculture figure, grew his hair long, and dressed like a hippie. And
Wow.
he met these middle American kids who like hated their parents, man, because that was the thing. And he would say things to them. He never told them what to do. So we would gather them around and he would say, everybody, things are getting really tough out in the world with the establishment. What do you think we should do? And they would give answers and he would say, yeah, maybe, maybe. And then when they would say something he wanted them to say, he would say, yeah,
Mhm.
that's a good idea. And before they knew it, he would guide them through questioning to basically they would come up with the idea that we should break into millionaires' homes and murder them, or whatever.
Wow.
So yeah, same exact principle. And Warren Buffett, many people feel is the most ethical financier out there. So
Okay, so that's terrifying because I've also taken the Dale Carnegie course. So now you have me questioning everything. How
but
creepy.
don't
Like,
don't question it because the point is this stuff, the moral of the story is this stuff is
it
going
works.
to exist whether
Yeah.
someone nice and well-meaning like you takes it and learns it or doesn't, right?
Right. Right.
So who do we want learning this material, like, and Dale Carnegie tapped into many, but not all, of the principles I talk about in the book. He's more focused on how to be um well liked in whatever you do, but psychology is psychology, and social psychology is social psychology. And yeah, it's these humans are you can't make a woodpecker into a rhinoceros, you know what I mean? I mean, human beings are what they are.
Wow, this is so fascinating. I want to talk a little bit about one of your principles is the idea of, make war, not love. Can we talk a little bit about what you've established or what you've found through your research as far as controversy goes?
Yeah, I mean, I made that hype strategy number one because in many ways, it's the most important strategy that everything else is based on. So the concept is that human beings, to a very large degree, are much more attracted to and bonded to um, negativity than positivity. And I don't mean that that means that people are walking around like depressives all day long. What I mean by that is, if you can make someone be against something, against a person, against an idea, against another kind of individual or group, that has a lot of power. And telling them what they should be for has a lot less power. And a lot of us want to reject that. Like, a lot of us will say, "Yeah, in the old days, everyone was aggressive, but I'm an enlightened figure. I'm a liberal. I'm open minded." But the story I always like to tell, that's very just an anecdote. I used to work in this uh, like workspace called the Brooklyn Writer Space when I was a full time writer. And all you just had to be a serious writer. So that could mean you were published. We had a lot. We had like 2 Pulitzer Prize winners in there. You could just be working on something, but it was Brooklyn. So Brooklyn is just like lousy with writers, right? And Brooklyn is a very, especially this part of Brooklyn, Brownstone, Brooklyn. It's a very crunchy. I don't know. It's liberal. It's artistic, and so these are the kind of people where guys in flannel, women don't wear makeup, people aren't consumerist, right? So I would walk into this thing and everyone would have their computers and would be writing. And in all the time I was there, I saw one PC, hundreds of people.
Wow.
It was 99.999% max. Now, why would that be? I've thought a lot about this because to these people, I mean, think about the Apple commercials that re-kicked off the Mac brand,
Hmm.
in the 90s. They had Justin Long as the hipster artistic guy, and they had John Hodgman, neither of whom were known at the time, as like the nerdy PC guy. And the idea was like, if you buy an Apple, you're not one of these corporate drones.
Yeah.
You're free and you're artistic and you're non-consumerist. Meanwhile, Apple at one point was the biggest. I mean, they were the most valuable company in the world. Frankly, they have some pretty. I mean, they have you know Chinese workers making their products at $2 an hour. So they're no less corporate than any other company on earth.
Yep.
But all of these people who are very politically liberal, who don't wear makeup, who are against brands, chose a brand because they're against being, you know, a straight arrow, a corporate person. So, yeah, I mean, we are just very, very attracted to being against things. So, if you can, let's say you're a business person, if you can say to yourself, what's a point of view in my industry that a lot of people believe, but I think is really misguided and really wrong, but a lot of people don't have the courage to speak up about. If you can speak up against that idea, there will be all these people who are looking for a leader who didn't have the guts to speak up to it or didn't have the inclination, and they will rally around you like moths to a light. Like, it's a very effective way to create a tribe and create a following.
So, just in that little section, you've said a lot, and I want to take a couple of those items and break it down. The idea of finding a common enemy, it's really interesting. I don't know where I learned that particular principle, but I had a coworker who we could not see eye to eye, and I remember that finding a common enemy was the best way that her and I could get on the same page. And at that point, it was just the idea. The common enemy was the idea that we were going to lose the department if we couldn't collaborate and get
Yeah,
along. But
exactly.
it was
That's a
still
great
finding it.
example. Yeah.
Yeah. And so even as you talked about some of these things like with Apple and how they've kind of positioned themselves, like the thing I wrote down is that our perception becomes our reality. And I think we sometimes don't understand how powerful that is.
Right. We don't want to believe that, right? Like I mean, I don't
Mhm.
know about you, but I study this stuff and I've dedicated a lot of my life to it. So there's a small part of me that thinks, oh, I'm immune to this kind of stuff. Like I can see the reality. And then I'll catch myself on a very regular basis falling into the exact same traps. I mean,
Mhm.
that whatever, my political tribe, there will be something that I have an inclination that the evidence sort of inclines me to say, I'm not so sure that my party is right about that, but I feel a
Mhm.
real discomfort. I look for reasons to see why I'm wrong, why that other point of view is wrong. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
what am I going to tell my friends if I'm for this and that my political party is so against? You know what I mean? Even if the
Mhm.
data is making a good case for it. So we're just very, very wired. We're the most social beings on earth. We're certainly the most social mammals. I mean, maybe bees and ants are more social than us, but we are by far the most social beings on earth. And that's part of the reason we're the dominant mammals on earth. It's why we can work together to fly airplanes and build bridges, but it's also why we kill off people and invade countries,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, even as you're talking about all this, I think about a recent Harvard Business Review article that was put out there around, whether you're vax or no vax, right? Like this whole idea that the government's going to force everyone to get
Right.
vaccinated
Right.
and that they're going to push it down on corporations so that your corporation, everyone
Right.
that works for you has to be vaccinated. And it did touch this thread that you talked about with humans and autonomy. It's different when it's their idea, right? So
Correct.
it's interesting that instead of the government spending the money to convince, they spent the money to force. And so it goes right back into this idea of psychology that you're talking about, which is we can either force or we can convince. And when we force, it creates fiefdoms, it creates these two, forces that are against one another versus spending the money to convince, which is that idea that if it's my idea, then I'm absolutely all in, I'm going to do it. But when it's your idea, I'm naturally wired to want to rage against that.
So it's funny that you say that. I agree. And also, I read another article recently that said that there was a very low adoption rate for a while in the African American community, and that's flipped over. And now there a lot of African Americans are getting inoculated. And the reason I think the cause for that success story was that there was a concerted effort to get influencers in people that a large number of African Americans admire, black
Mhm.
people who
Yep.
had a lot of sway, celebrities or whatever, to come in and say get vaccinated. I don't think it's working as well with the larger population of white, largely rural people, because the influencers in that community don't tend to be persuadable, right? So
Yeah.
that's actually another principle in the book. I call it create a secret society, or the piggybacking method. So a lot of hype
Mhm.
artists, as I call them, and by the way, I define hype as just any activity that gets a large number of people emotional to get them to take an action. So it's not a negative term as I define it. It's neutral, right? So a lot of people that I call hype artists who are very successful, they make their success look grassroots. Like everyone just found what they
Mhm.
were working on and just it grew. But
Yep.
what they really do is they spend a lot of time nurturing connections with very powerful and influential people who spread the word for them. And so it seems very uh, natural when that happens. So a lot of times that the best way to get somebody or large numbers of people to see the world your way is to get the people they look to for their ideas convinced.
Wow. So, man, you well, so not to go back too far, but I do
Please.
want to
Yeah.
say that I think part of what I heard about just Black community is everybody when it comes to vaccinations, everybody always goes back to this is what happened negative in our society, right? When Black people were
Well, that
tested.
was the reason
Yeah.
for black people not to. It was a very
Yes.
different reason than white people. They had
Yeah.
actual with Tuskegee and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like a high mistrust, right?
Right.
It's the high mistrust. So it's almost like
For an
what
understandable I mean, in
are
that case,
very
that's a good
yeah.
reason. Yeah.
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 Yeah, but it's almost like that idea of, well, what can unseat that thing that you like? What can be what can be trusted or not trusted even more than that? So it's almost like when you and we take this into the psychology world, when you have such a big enemy of mistrust, like what can overcome that? And I think in all of our businesses and all the places where we have objections in our life on why somebody isn't willing to move in a specific direction, it's asking that question, like what can unseat something that is that huge, in order to get movement. And I think it
Yeah.
applies in almost every industry that you could possibly think of. And then I wanted to go back to this idea that you said, which I wrote it down because it was so powerful. Just the idea of someone that looks grassroots on the surface is actually nurturing connections with powerful and influential people, so that those people will spread the word. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite stories in the book. I love telling these stories because these hype artists are so amazing in what they do. And if you kind of take your preconceptions out of it, you can learn so much. So there was this guy named Edward Bernays who, I mean, he was at his heyday in like the 20s and 30s, and he was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and he decided to use his psychological savvy for much more commercial aims. So he invented the field of PR, of public relations. He actually originally called it propaganda. And then
Wow.
when that got negative, but it wasn't considered, basically the wars are what made that negative.
Yeah.
That was just a word
Yeah.
meant to propagate something.
Mhm.
He actually wrote a book called Propaganda. And then when that didn't work anymore, he renamed it Public Relations. So if you're in public relations, that's your legacy. Um, but this guy was really responsible for a lot of big developments that we don't know, that most people don't know. So so before him, smoking was just something women did not do. It was considered extremely uncouth. And what he
Yeah.
did was the suffragettes, the first feminists really were coming out at the time. And he had this spontaneous Torches for Liberty thing. It was like a feminist suffragette parade. And he had women lighting up cigarettes, like, you can't tell me what to do kind of thing. It was like a thing of liberation. So before long, everyone was swinging, but his client was Lucky Strike. So that's why he did that.
Mhm.
And they needed a new market. So one of the things he did that really illustrates this point, he was hired by Beechnut. And I didn't know this. I think of Beechnut as like the candy and everything.
Mhm.
But at the time, they started out as a ham and pork company. So they were a
Oh,
really major pork and ham producer. And then it turned into all kinds of other products. But at the time, they really wanted to up bacon consumption because, weirdly enough, Americans didn't eat bacon for breakfast as a cultural thing before the 20s. So Edward Bernays he understood this concept. So he had spent years nurturing, sometimes in his case, in very like devious ways. He probably was paying off people, but he would nurture relationships with this extremely influential people. And one guy was a doctor who had like connections with 5,000 other doctors. He was this very respected doctor. So he got this doctor to commission a study that said that bacon is the healthiest breakfast food because it replaces the energy that you lose during sleep. So before long, every doctor in America was recommending bacon, no advertisements, nothing, and it changed the country. So the
wow.
lesson here, I just want to say, the lesson here is not to pay doctors off. The lesson here is not to fake bogus studies. That is not, although I drink a lot of coffee, and there was some study that came out that said it's okay to drink 15 cups of coffee. And my first impression was, I was like, oh, fantastic. And I'm like, oh, give me a break. Like
Yeah.
who sponsored this study, right? Like, so, but I guess the point here is that you should really spend a lot of time before you need it, not just networking, but building an equivalent of what they used to call in the old days the old boys network. And it can have
Yeah.
women too,
Yeah.
obviously. But the whole point is people used to complain. They would say it's who you know, there's an old boys network. But there's unparalleled opportunity to create your own circle of friends who is like a mutual appreciation society. So, like, the trick to this is figure out, look at all your assets. And I don't just mean money. In fact, I mean money the least. It's like, what do you have that you can give people that's cheap for you financially or otherwise to give up that's very valuable to them? So, like, for example, I interviewed this guy just because I was a business journalist, at one point, and I interviewed this guy who owned a $500 million company that he started from his garage, literally from his garage. He was like assembling alarm pieces in his garage. And this guy had everything, right? I mean, he had
Mm.
anything you can think of. So wealthy. But he had just moved from Indiana to New York. And I was talking to him afterwards, and he was kind of like, oh, one of the reasons I moved here is, I don't have to take such an active role in the company anymore. And I've always loved live music, and I've just Indiana, there's nothing there. And I'm in New York. And I'm a huge music fan. I used to play music, et cetera, et cetera. So I was like, oh, I can show you around. I'll take you to like cool places. So he became like my biggest mentor. You know what I mean? So if you have a podcast, invite people that you want to meet on the podcast and then do
Yeah.
favors for them. If you have, if you're on Twitter or Instagram, instead of hammering people about business stuff and inspirational quotes, watch people you're interested in, see where you connect as a human being. Are you both into the same football team? Do you both play saxophone? Talk about that, because everyone is a human being first. No one needs to see your business inspirational quotes, and for
Right.
anyone doing those, it's fine, but like that's not going to build this group. And the goal isn't to
Yeah.
network and hand out your business card and all this. It's to create a group of people that you don't need anything from, but that is so tight with you that when you do need something from them, when you say to them, listen, I just came out with my first book, can you promote it? It's like asking your friend from college. It's just something
Yeah.
that you wouldn't even bother to do, because people who know people make these things happen. And that's just so key. It goes beyond what people think of as quote unquote networking.
I love that. I love that. What final thoughts would you leave our listeners with today?
I guess I would just say that if you're feeling an aversion to what I'm saying, if you're saying to yourself, I'm not a promotional kind of person, this doesn't sound right for me, I don't want to wade in the muck with these Edward Bernays type people, what I would challenge you to think about is that these people are out there getting attention, and they're going to keep getting attention. And they're using strategies that, while the content of what they do is negative, the strategies are not necessarily negative. It's about the way we operate as networks. It's about the way we perceive reality. And if you have a moral code, don't deceive people. This does not require deception. Make the world better than it was before. I would say it's your moral imperative. If you really believe in the work you're doing, if you're doing work that's making the world a better place, and if you're not, you need to fix that. But if you're doing work that's making the world a better place, it's your moral imperative to learn how to master human nature and get large numbers of people emotional so they'll give it a chance. Because otherwise, it's the hucksters and who get it naturally, who are going to keep getting all the attention. And we've seen that at a very high level lately, how that can be damaging. So I just really, I want to turn hype artistry into a positive. And I hope this affects a few people out there in that regard.
I love that. It definitely affected me. You
Great.
have me rethinking so many
you.
things. Yeah, it's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Michael.
This was so much fun. I love this interview. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, guys, in the show notes, you will find all the different places that you can follow Michael. But I want to mention Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and then, of course, head over to Amazon, get his book, because I think that after listening to this, you have to be as intrigued as I am. So to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. And remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.